Welcome back to Builders, Makers, Doers. I'm Andy Bassett, here solo because we're doing it a little different this week. Instead of actually shooting the podcast like we normally do, we're going to replay a webinar that Elliot and I just hosted called the Resiliency Framework, with the theme of how do we increase profits and decrease stress by way of our risk management program. So let's build off that. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, excited about the conversation today. And it's just that. It's really a conversation. Elliot and I, of course, will lead through it, and we'll just talk about the things we're talking about kind of every day, frankly. And we'll go through the presentation or the PowerPoint. But please know that there is a chat. And, this is designed to, the content itself is not going to take us up to the end of the hour. The hope is that your questions or time at the end for questions is, where we fill some of that time. So please put questions in. Elliot, anything?
Yeah, everybody, we love to get the interaction as we're going through. So the chat's a great way to do that. Obviously, you can interject at any point too. But Cam just posted a little message in there. If everybody could pull up the chat, throw in how you're doing today, how you feeling, what's going on, what's on your brain. We just love to kind of kick it off and make sure everybody's got the chat up and ready to post in there. Because again, we really want this to be about what you want to hear and where you want to take it. And that's a great way to do it. So also just feel free, like we said, to interject at any point. We'll have the conversation. So with that, let's dive in, Andy.
Let's roll. If I'm doing this right, Cam, is the one on my left, is that the screen they're seeing? The resiliency framework. All right, perfect. Yes. So what we will talk about today, the resiliency framework, it's really increased profits, decrease stress, exactly as it says. So, who doesn't want to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Thinking through today, the lens I think we want to have everybody have is, when we think about risk management, traditionally, we think about costs associated with it and expense. And today we want to kind of flip that mindset to how do we look at, from a risk management framework, how do we actually think about increasing profit in our organizations to achieve our goals and do all the things we're looking to do? And of course, decrease stress at the same time. As I said earlier, it's designed to be a conversation. So please ask questions, share what's on your mind, share real life scenarios, whatever you're comfortable doing. But I also started to mention a bit ago that we're running this slightly unique than we usually do, or different than we usually do. Usually Elliot is sitting next to me and I would open up introductions by saying, I'm Andy Bassett, and I would point to my side, is Elliot Bassett. But today, Elliot, I'll let you jump in and say hi. Elliot is remote because a little bit of a stomach bug has entered into his house and we elected to not have him bring it to the office.
Yeah, the neurovirus has hit our household, so we are down for the count. But I have somehow not caught it yet. I'm sure it's coming, but glad that I can be here, at least virtually. So,
well, glad to have you on. The beauty of technology today is we can just roll with the punches, right? And neurovirus is a punch for sure. But as stated, I'm Andy Bassett. I'm the CEO here at Ellerbrock-Norris. Elliot Bassett, we do share the same last name. Many of you know that. We're cousins. Elliot is president of Ellerbrock-Norris, but we're super excited to dive into today's conversation. Again, these are things that we're talking about all day, every day, not only with our clients from an advisory perspective, but also how we navigate our business every day. And so I always like to share that because we've built Ellerbrock-Norris to remain privately held and independently owned, which is pretty rare in our industry at this point. But why that means something is we're navigating the same things you all are every day. And so this is all very near and dear to us, not just from the advisor perspective, but from the business owner lens as well. So before we dive in, we always like to touch briefly, quickly on our brand tagline here at Ellerbrock-Norris, which is protect your purpose. And I think this is a lens I do want everybody to think through, because I think this is really important for all of us as business owners, executives, leaders in our companies, is when we talk about these conversations, not only think about it through the lens of your business, but also your life or the lives of your employees and other leaders. And then, of course, the future for all those folks. When we talk about my business, my life, my future, and protecting our purpose, if we do things the right way and navigate these conversations at a high level, it can touch and impact not only our businesses, but our personal lives and ultimately the futures we build for ourselves. So a great lens for all of us to think through as we dive into the conversation.
Awesome, man. That's a good spot to lay out kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And I think to Andy's point, what we're trying to accomplish today is being able to show all of you that a lot of times risk management is thought of as a cost in your business. And we really want to show you how that can actually drive profits in your business. And if you take the approach that we just talked through with the protect your purpose, where this is all intertwined, these aren't siloed conversations, you can actually make a lot of these strategies work towards increasing your profit and decreasing stress. So what we want to hit on today is what is the resiliency problem as we've outlined it. So we're going to walk through how to think about that as a business owner. What are the 10 impact areas of risk? So these are how we categorize different areas of risk in your business so that we can actually put strategies, we can make it concrete on what we're trying to go accomplish. Risk a lot of times is kind of thought as this gray area in your business because it encompasses so many things. And the 10 impact areas of risk help us organize that a lot better. And then we're going to hit on the 5 key metrics to measure, really getting actionable in those so that you can take things away to go implement, how to implement those. And then, as Andy mentioned, we'll open it up for any questions that you guys have for us.
Yeah.
So again, designed to be very impactful, very useful, and then any questions as we go. So
yeah,
go ahead.
exactly. And the key metrics we're going to talk about, these are going to be real life scenarios that we've seen in businesses that we work with, where these strategies actually result in real dollars that increase profit and allow those companies to achieve success and their goals. So yeah, excited to dive in. Thanks for going over the agenda, Elliot. So first off, the resiliency problem. Really, again, it goes back to the theme here that we're talking about, which is shifting our mindset around risk management and getting away from thinking about it as an expense, thinking about it as a cost, thinking about it as, you know, something that kind of hits the back burner a lot of times, and trying to put it, you know, kind of at the forefront of our minds as a strategy to actually increase profit, allow us to grow our company, achieve our goals, hit our vision, and do all the things that we set out as business owners to do every day. And so I think people have a hard time viewing risk management in that light. And so, you know, we're going to kind of try to challenge that thought and maybe, you know, get everybody on this webinar to maybe think a little bit differently in one way or another around risk management and the resilience. Because at the end of the day, that's what everything we're talking about. If we can create truly resilient businesses, we have the opportunity to do really awesome things over time. So when we talk about this problem, it really starts with risk. And this graphic, I think, does a good job of just getting our eyes to think, our minds to think about risk. And when we think about risk, it really sits over our businesses in a lot of different ways. You know, there's really 3 main categories of risk that we talk a lot about with our clients. There's business risk, strategic, and hazard. Business is the ongoing day-to-day stuff that happens in our organization. Somebody doesn't show up for work or whatever the case is. Strategic is more long-term thinking. You know, what are we going to do? We might enter a new market. We may build a new widget or get into a new service, you know, more forward thinking. Then hazard are the things that often we think about when we talk about insurance related things like fires or employee injuries or a lawsuit or whatever. Those are the different categories of risk. And then we can think about, you know, the different ways we can manage risk. We can prevent, you know, just do things to not even have that risk enter our radar at all. That may mean not making the widget I referenced or not getting into the service. We can mitigate risk. We can do things that we know risk is going to exist, but we can implement strategies to reduce its impact on our company. We can transfer risk. That's through contracts and things of that nature. Very common in the construction and trades. You guys are all very familiar with that. Financing risk would be the insurance element. And that's what we're going to talk about, kind of the resiliency problem here in a minute, is we're going to focus a little bit more on how people view insurance specifically when it comes to risk management. And then, of course, we can assume risk, which is a big piece of what we do every day as business owners. You know, we have different tolerance for risk. Part of the problem is sometimes if we don't go through the framework we're going to talk about today, that assumption of risk happens after the fact, and we haven't prepared for it, you know, on our balance sheet or on our plans and strategies in an organization. So if we're going to assume risk, we want to understand what those risks are and how they're going to impact our company. So that's kind of a framework of how we look at risk here in our organization and talk with our clients about it. But the problem is, and again, the resiliency problem and then the dilemma when we talk about insurance is, you know, risk management and insurance become very synonymous in people's minds. You know, I would bet most of you that hear the term risk management, you think of insurance right away. And that's really what our industry has kind of done over time as we talk about, and again, it's highlighted as the finance risk management strategy on the bottom of the top half of this chart. Everybody wants to talk about how we manage risk simply from buying insurance products and then trying to work our way up to what risks that addresses in our organization. The unfortunate piece is it primarily only addresses hazard risks. And as we talked about earlier, the lion's share of the risks in our industry or in our businesses exist outside of hazard. They exist in our business risks. They exist in our strategic risks. So the bottom half of that chart is the framework we're going to talk through today, or what we want everybody to think through is, let's not start with the insurance risk management strategy and try and work our way up as to how that becomes our risk management program, but rather let's go through, understand, analyze all the risks that exist, and then work our way down to how do we best manage those and get that to be a coordinated effort. And when we talk about the 10 impact areas of risk, as I turn it over to Elliot here in a bit, that is going to be a big piece of the framework. Is these different areas with singular strategies, we can make massive movement across multiple impact areas. And so that's the lens we want to look through. Elliot, anything you would add as I went through those few slides?
Yeah, I mean, I think the importance is just understanding the framework to work through this in your business, because every business is different and there's no one size fits all when it comes to risk management or even just insurance programs. Oftentimes, that's how you'll hear it sold is, all insurance is the same, and, one contractor looks like the next contractor, but that's really not the lens in which we need to be looking at it. We need to look at your individual business, identify the risks that you have associated with your business. What's your tolerance for risk? Because everybody wants to assume different levels of risk or transfer different levels of risk. And so it's really about going through that methodical process, which Andy just laid out, that's most important.
Exactly. And good point. While all businesses are different and unique, I imagine when you look at this slide, you realize really quickly, we all have a lot of the same top expenses.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Elliot, I'll turn it over to you to kind of dive into this section.
Well, we wanted to highlight some ways that we can look at this from a, cost perspective, and how some of these risk management strategies relate directly to multiple different expenses that you're typically seeing on your balance sheet and P&L. And so we've just pulled the top 10 in a contractor business, typically the top 10 expenses. And so, we want to start to think about how do some of these risks impact these various different expenses. And so we'll walk through some examples here and, talk through the concept. And so, you have a foreman, he's one of your best, he's doing a lot for you. All of a sudden he walks one day and says, hey, I'm going to, our competitor, they're giving me a raise, I'm leaving in 2 weeks. Well, obviously that's going to be a payroll impact, or you probably may have to go out and spend more to get somebody to replace them because you needed that person fast, et cetera. You've got all the benefits and HR related issues with that, the recruiting. We all know the statistics, or if you have heard the statistics around what it costs to go out and recruit. When you lose somebody, what the turnover costs you is, 2 to 3 times their salary, typically. And then just the administrative and overhead burden, right? You have impacts to the operations, the day-to-day of the business that now you're taken away from doing your most important work because you might have to fill in for the foreman, or you've got to adjust things. And so, one risk impacts several different expense categories.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's the lens that is going to be thematic through this is, here's one example, and we can see, we just highlighted 3, but you can make an argument that this scenario even impacts more. And so again, as we think about risk management, we think about driving profit. If we can avoid these things from happening because we manage risk at a high level, we are thereby ultimately increasing profit because we're not increasing these expenses in these moments.
Yep. Bingo. So another example, sub-installed the wrong widget or did the job wrong and isn't going to pay for the fix. This might come down to contracts, how your sub-agreements are written, but ultimately, going to impact potentially your payroll. You've got to pull other people off of other jobs, have them go and fix the thing. Obviously material and supplies to go and make the fix, subcontractor costs, so on and so forth, again, because maybe you hired the wrong sub, you didn't vet them. Maybe your sub agreements aren't where they should be. Oftentimes those get overlooked from a legal perspective, and that can help prevent, your risk in a situation like that. But again, to Andy's point, we could argue where that sits across the other areas, but can be a big impact. Another example, more of an employee injury related. You have an employee that cuts their hand on the job, can't come in tomorrow. Obviously, depending on how bad the injury is, that can impact several different things. You've got lack of productivity. Your payroll changes again. We've got to shift people around. We've got to move those people. Maybe you've got overtime that now you've got to pick up the jobs. It's costing you money. Benefits and HR again talked about that. But on the insurance end, it can be a massive impact. And I'm sure everybody on this call has probably dealt with it at some point. But when do we get them back to work? How do we get them back to work in a light duty capacity? How do we minimize the impact of that claim on our work comp and our experience mod? And those are all things that we certainly are going to have a less of an opportunity to minimize and mitigate the impact of that claim if we're addressing it after the fact. So having a really proactive way to work through that and prepare for it is really important to minimize those costs.
Well, and I think, we have everybody on here primarily is in the trades, and, our people are hugely important to us. And obviously this is a minor example when we talk about a cut hand, but we talk about injuries, and we're talking obviously about the hard costs associated with increasing expenses, reducing profit as a result of these things. But I know how important these types of things are to everybody on this call, because again, your people are what drive your businesses. And so I guess I want to highlight too that we can't forget the emotional impact these things have. I mean, if this was a more serious scenario, that has real implications in long-term, obviously expenses as well. But just, we don't want to lose sight of there is the human and emotional element that does tie into all of this as well, which is a big piece we all know of the day-to-day in our businesses.
Yeah. And then, this last one is another example where it hits multiple different areas. You have an employee, Mike, wrecks his work truck, headed to the ER, broken wrist, truck's totaled. We've, maybe have experienced this in the past, but see the many different areas in your business that's going to impact, right? Payroll, benefits, materials and supplies. Maybe he was taking materials to a job site. Obviously, your insurance costs, vehicles, etc. And what was interesting to me with this one is oftentimes when we discuss risk with contractors, particularly the employee injury risk, it's oftentimes thought of getting hurt on the job, which is obviously there's a lot of risks on a job site that somebody could get hurt. However, the more frequent and higher severity risks to employee injury is actually when they're driving a vehicle, hands down 100%, because that's a work-related injury. It's typically more severe depending on the accident, obviously. And then you obviously have all the additional issues with your vehicles, the insurance claim on those, and et cetera. And so that seems to always come up as the highest risk to employee injury in a construction company.
Absolutely. Well, and the other thing I'd add to that, because when I saw this one, I thought about, the litigation side, right? So, anybody that's been involved, and obviously our vehicles are going to be a big piece of where we could, if we're not managing risk at a high level, be subjected to large litigation if something really bad happens to a third party. But my point is, this stuff doesn't always just happen in the moment and we move on. I mean, if you've ever been involved, and we know the expenses that go into that, but if you've ever been involved in, a large, nasty lawsuit, these things can drag on years with depositions. And again, the emotional strain and stress and people's time being pulled away. And, this stuff doesn't end, quickly in a lot of regards. And so that's really what came to my mind when I saw this, because unfortunately, we've been involved in a lot of that stuff with our clients over time, and we've seen, the impact it has over years, and it's real.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm assuming maybe one of those resonates with everybody, in your business, maybe you've dealt with some of those. But we then want to show, okay, those are some of the risks that can happen, and showing the different areas of the business that we don't often look at for the impacts of those risks. How do we organize that, as we mentioned earlier, the 10 impact areas of risk? And so in the framework Andy laid out, we call them business, strategic, and hazard, for just to identify the process. In reality, we're breaking those 3 buckets out into 10 impact areas of risk. And what those are look like this. And so this spans kind of everything from what we mentioned earlier, traditionally is thought of as risk management, which would be insurance, through perpetuation planning and how are you going to exit the business? What are you going to do next with the business? How are you going to monetize it? That's kind of your future, your retirement. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Everything surrounding your employees, the benefits, the safety, compliance, key personnel planning is a big one. We referenced that risk was the first one. How do we keep our employees happy and with the company long term? And so these are how we kind of organize this conversation. We want to identify the risk first and foremost, prioritize it, and then we can actually figure out how we deal with it. But then just to show how we can use these impact areas can impact different areas of those expenses. Let's think about safety. We've mentioned two of those examples were related to employee injuries, right? How do we keep our employees safe on the job site, in the vehicle, et cetera? And so these have many different impacts on basically leading the expenses that lead to your P&L, your profit. And so we've got the benefits in HR. When an employee gets hurt, it takes a lot of resources to make sure that an employee's getting the care that they need, they're getting back to work when they need to. Are we documenting everything appropriately? If you've been in one of those incidents, it can be a lot of work for your HR folks or whoever's handling that. Equipment. Does equipment get damaged? Is it maintained? Are we keeping it up to any sort of compliance related standards that we need to? Are we doing training that we need to? That's a big one that we're talking to contractors about now, because frankly, it's really difficult to keep track of all the training you're required to do for some of this equipment that your employees are on. Safety, obviously a big one. Work comp, one of the biggest costs in a business, in a construction business, and that can fluctuate quickly. Well, we're seeing now, and I don't know if anybody's experienced this, but if your mod can get above 1, there's many job sites, many general contractors that will not allow you to work on their job sites. And so not only is that insurance premium, but now you're losing out on profits from jobs. And then obviously the administrative overhead hit a little bit of that in the HR. But again, when somebody gets injured, it takes a lot of work to make sure that's handled appropriately.
Yeah, and I want to highlight what you said there about the insurance piece, because people do, and it's very natural to be able to see the mod, and we're going to talk about that as one of the real life examples, as the direct, obvious cost, but the indirect costs associated with that, like not being able to get on job sites and missing out on opportunities. Sometimes people lose sight of that, and those can be, even much bigger dollars than the direct hard costs that people, oftentimes focus on. So I'm glad you referenced that.
Yeah, totally. So then, insurance, again, we love to hit on this one and talk about the impacts, because it's oftentimes sold in the industry as a one size fits all, as it's very simple, et cetera. But it has many layers of your business. Again, equipment. You guys are purchasing and using equipment that can be very expensive, and making sure that is insured correctly is very important. Obviously, insurance, hitting the insurance bucket, but just what are our premiums doing? What are our rates? How are they moving? Are they moving in line with the industry, with the market? Or am I being adversely impacted because of my claims history? Those are all things that need to go into that conversation. Impacts your vehicle costs, your subcontractor costs. You're insuring your buildings, you're insuring all your facilities and everything. Bonding can be a big one. If you aren't able to get bonding for jobs that require bonds, you may not be able to do that work, as we mentioned earlier. And so again, it goes beyond just a premium in how these things should be looked at and the impact it has across your business. And then I love this one, business continuity, because it spans kind of almost all of the other ones. But business continuity is oftentimes thought of as, disaster planning. What do I do when the natural disaster happens? Which is a big component of business continuity. Don't get me wrong. If you have the fire, if you have the tornado, how are you going to get back up and running so that you can generate revenue in your business? But what we often overlook are how it corresponds with some of these other areas of risk, which would be employees. What do we do if Joe can't come to work tomorrow? Does Joe know certain things that only Joe knows how to do? And that can be a risk to the business. You have suppliers that you rely upon. You have large customers that you rely upon. What happens if those go away? You can't get equipment that's essential to your business. That can be a big risk. So again, we can keep going down the list, but this business continuity is a very wide-ranging risk that oftentimes gets overlooked, because again, it gets focused on from just a natural disaster perspective, but it's extremely wide-ranging.
Absolutely. And we're going to dive into some real examples that we've seen here. But before we do that, I know Elliot had said early on that, no business is the same. we all have unique risks and we need to customize how we approach this. That's absolutely true. That being said, the 10 impact areas of risk, if you think about it, I always kind of joke around. If you peel back the roof of most businesses and you look inside, we all deal with a lot of the same things. So high level, 30,000 foot look, when we categorize this stuff, it really does oftentimes fall into one of those impact areas of risk. And then again, as Elliot just laid out and highlighted, when we start to build plans and strategies to address each of those areas, we're able to impact multiple different facets of the business. And so again, thinking through the framework of risk management not being an expense, but rather something that can drive, bottom line and profit, that's that lens. Also, as I get into the real life examples we're going to talk about, please, I don't know that we have any questions yet, do we, Cam? But also, not necessarily a question, but if you have an example or scenario or something that comes to your mind that you want to share in addition to these, we'd love to talk about it.
Resonate with you, yeah.
Yeah, if something resonates please put a comment in and we can dive into that or give our 2 cents on it. But we'll dive in here to a few examples. So we're going to start on, Elliot had touched on this a little bit when he was going through the prior slides, but this is definitely a natural one that a lot of people think about in the construction space when they think about the direct costs associated with managing risk, and it's your EMOD. Everybody, I'm sure, on here knows that, our EMOD directly impacts our cost of work comp insurance. And to Elliot's point earlier, it can also impact our ability to get on job sites. So, we need to have plans and strategies how to control it. Obviously, you can see on here doing the safety training, return to work, which is going to be kind of what we'll highlight in this real life example here. Have healthcare clinic provider relationships, pre-employment screening, compliance, all of those things. It does move the needle, absolutely. And again, not just in the mod, ability to get jobs, employee morale, all the things that go into having a safe workplace. And at the end of the day, if we're focused on safety and having that as a culture, our people are going home the way they came to work. And that's impacting their families, their lives, their communities, and everything else we all set out to, the reasons we own and run small businesses in America. All right. So example scenario. Looks like I have to click a couple times. I'm just going to have it all pull up here because it's easier for me to read through that, Cam. So what we're talking about here is a single lost time injury. So a lot of people probably know that when somebody's injured in and out of the course of employment, we have a workers' compensation claim. If we can have them get back to work, and it's a medical only claim in many states, most states, Nebraska being one where we're talking to you from here today, that gets discounted by 70% in its impact on the mod. So this is a real life example, and this is where you can really truly see direct ROI of investing in safety, specifically a recover or return to work program for our employees. So this is your quintessential kind of average everyday $14,068 event that if we don't have the right risk management strategies in place, we're not getting people back to work, and that full claim gets factored into this real life example, their mod is a 1.30. Now, obviously, they've had some other stuff happen to have a 1.3 mod. It's not just a single event, but 1.3. Now, if they're managing risk at the highest level, they've got a good return to work program. This person doesn't lose time. The insurance company doesn't have to pay lost wages. There's no indemnity owed is ultimately the term. And it goes in as a medical only. Their mod actually gets factored at 1.27. Well, all of us in this business know that sticks with us for a period of 3 years. So for this client in this example, that impact in cost over 3 years is over $37,000. So these are real dollars, not to mention, again, the indirect costs associated with, if this person had been at home, not in return to work, does an attorney get a hold of it? Does the value of the claim get a lot higher? Does the time away from work extend? Is the employee's morale down because they're at home, they're not at work with their, coworkers and doing the things they do to impact their work, their job, society, all the things that go on. Like, there are so many indirect costs, but it's very clear, very easy to see that an investment in safety, specifically recover at work, can have real impact to the tune in this example of over 37 grand for 3 years. So real life example, real life dollars that can increase profit. Second example, there are so many things when it comes to health insurance costs that I know a lot of people feel like they don't have a lot of control over health insurance, benefits, but specifically health insurance costs. It's a pretty big myth in a lot of regards. There are a lot of levers that can be pulled, a lot of things that can be done, not only to control costs, but to increase benefits at the same time. So, it's definitely a big expense, and there are a lot of things that can be done to move the needle. Obviously, if you're self-insured, there's a lot more things that can be done. Education is a huge piece of it. I think we talk all the time, what drives health insurance costs oftentimes or mostly is, how we consume healthcare. And obviously our employees as employers is who are relying on being better consumers of healthcare. And without education, that's hard to do. There's specialty RX programs, independent PBMs, care navigation. There's a lot of different levers, but real life scenario. This is an exact example of a cost per employee for a client of ours. And so what we're showing here from a chart perspective is over the period of time from 2013 on, had they not gone the route of taking more control of how they finance risk on the benefits and healthcare side, using the standard 8%, which frankly, I think a lot of you that are listening to this are going to say that's probably light. But if we make that assumption, you can see what that red line does over time. Just a continual increase and significant expense versus when you go to self-funded, when you do things, and again, self-funded may or may not make sense, may or may not even be available, but the principles are still the same, which is how do we understand, educate, and do the things we can to take more control. And when you do, the dollars get real, and you can see the significance of to the tune of about 42% less cost in 2024 versus had they kind of stayed status quo. So all you can think through what you spend when it comes to benefits year in and year out, and you can realize these are significant and real dollars.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, Andy, on the benefits side. The biggest thing is just making sure you understand the opportunities available to you. Mm-hmm. Because again, similar to other areas of insurance, is a lot of times, a renewal is just brought in and, hey, I negotiated it down from a 17 to an 8%. It's great this year. And, you don't really have transparency into what all your options are. And so I think that's the most important thing from a health insurance perspective is, to Andy's point, there's a lot of things you can do, a lot of things that won't make sense for your business, but just understanding what you have available to you is really important.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point is the cost. Obviously this chart is highlighting the direct cost per employee. Believe me, we understand, and anybody that's on the human resources side, there is a massive cost in disruption. There's a massive cost in, employee engagement and employees being unhappy. So these decisions are not made in silos and they're not uniform across all companies. Anything that anybody should ever think through this lens is don't look at it in a microscope to where it's just to try to save a few bucks, because on the back end, you could be bleeding from a turnover standpoint, from a disruption standpoint, from, people being unhappy and all the things that are, obviously avoidable when you think through it more strategically. Elliot, you want to jump in and take over?
Yeah, and we'll keep it moving. I just looked at the time. We might want to keep it moving quick here, but I talked about this one a little bit earlier, business continuity. And so what we want to focus on this one is having a continuity plan, but specifically around an area that a lot of people don't think about, which is client concentration. So how much of your revenue is tied up into a single client or a handful of clients, and how exposed are you to those clients leaving, going out of business, et cetera? And so how you can control it, have a continuity plan. Be thinking about, if it's a supplier, what are my B, C, D suppliers that could step in when that supplier goes out of business or something happens. Key people can be a good one, where you can make sure that you're maintaining those existing relationships. Diversify your revenue streams with a client that is, or so you're not as reliant on a single client. And then obviously growth and marketing. As you continue to grow, you're going to naturally diversify out of that. But real life example, and this is a great one because this is an actual client example, or from an insurance carrier, I guess, of ours. But large manufacturer, their building burns down. The insurance that they had was great. It came in, paid their lost revenue, rebuilt the building, got them back up and running. But at the end of the day, what they didn't factor in is that all of their clients that couldn't get product from them for 18 months went to their competitors. And they didn't have a way to get those clients back. And so they ultimately, even though the building was rebuilt, their revenues for that time period were replaced, they still went out of business because they couldn't replace those clients. And so we just have a graphic here to kind of show you and think about the different concentration risks within your business, and then how could you focus on diversifying those to other streams so you're not so reliant on single clients or a handful of clients. And so this is, again, a really good one. The business continuity in this particular case is not always thought of as a major risk, but it can literally put a business out of business.
Yeah, I mean, people think I've got insurance. Well, they did. They had good insurance. But, and the other piece of that story that was two of their key employees saw this happening and they left and went to work for a competitor because they saw the path. And so, you know, when it rains, it pours.
Yep. Okay, so number 4, business transition. This is one of our most fun topics to talk about. So what we're essentially talking about is multiple different things, but what are you going to do with the business? How are you going to monetize it? And a lot of things go into that. What's the valuation? That depends on, are you going to do an external sale, internal perpetuation, so on and so forth. There's tax implications. These things, to do it right, can take a long time. And so prepping for how you want to transition the business is big. And unfortunately, what we find is many business owners have to make a decision that they wouldn't ultimately want to do for the future of the business because they didn't necessarily plan for the future of the business, and they just don't have the time to make it work. So they have to end up selling it or something like that when really they would rather perpetuate it down. And so some of the ways that you can think about controlling this, have a formal business exit plan with clear timeline, even if you're not planning on exiting the business anytime soon. This is super important. We will all exit our businesses at some point, whether that's planned or unplanned. And so having a plan that you've thought through is important. Get a professional valuation done at a certain time. That doesn't have to be necessarily every year business is worth, so that you can make better decisions. Buy-sell agreements are huge. Some of those can be funded with life insurance, so on and so forth. Tax efficiency planning and key person continuity planning. If you can't keep key people that can take over the business, you won't be able to perpetuate it internally. So just another example, how can the planning impact a scenario? And so this is just another fantastic example. We actually had a client come to us. He had an offer to buy his business and he just wanted our opinion. He had a key person that was ready, but he didn't know, what is it worth? Like, what should I be doing? Is it going to be worth more down the road? I don't know if I'm ready to sell it. And so we actually said, hey, let's pump the brakes on this deal. Let's put together a plan and let's go and execute that plan so you can get the most value for your business. 3 years later, he had gotten multiple offers in that time period, but 3 years later, he sold it for more than double what he would have sold it in that original offer. And that's just because we had a plan. That's just because we looked at it, we got the value, we realized what it was worth, and we were ultimately able to execute that plan and sell it at the right time. And so that goes into, again, a few of the things: valuation, tax savings, where you implement a lot of different tax efficiency planning when you're doing these deals, if you do it over the right time period, and then making it a smooth transition. So just to highlight that further, this is going to be kind of hard to read, but 6 things that everyone should know before you exit. And again, we're not going to read through all these. We can get you these graphics, but have a formal business valuation. If you're looking to perpetuate the business internally, identify those people, make sure that they know about that. We've had a situation where father-in-law, son-in-law business, father-in-law thinks, I'm just going to sell it to my son-in-law. It's great. He had it all planned out. Son-in-law doesn't know anything about the plan and is nervous that he's not going to have a job in 3 years. And so, having those conversations is important. Having a buy-sell agreement, making sure it's funded the appropriate way, tax efficiency structure. So again, making sure that we can minimize the impact of taxes, key person continuity, and then a long runway is really important in these particular areas.
Absolutely. And something I'll add to that, the example that Elliot was referencing was a third-party sale. So value maximization is a big deal. But I would argue that when we talk about having a plan, it is probably even more important when we're talking about perpetuating internally. It's something we're near and dear to here at Ellerbrock-Norris because it's how we built our company. But the longer you have a runway, the more you can get the exiting partners made whole. You can have it work within the operations of the business to make those coming in and acquiring to be able to do it and do it without disrupting the business. And so It's complex. There's a lot of things that go into it. And for those of you that are owners or owners to be of businesses that are looking to do things internally, which we commend you for doing that. It's amazing. It's awesome, but it isn't easy. And it certainly takes a plan, a strategy, and a long runway. So know that and start thinking about it if that's you. All right. All right. So the last metric, if you will, we'll talk about is risk profile score. This is something we talk a lot about, and it's just understanding who you are and where risks lie in a company, right? And when we talk about the 10 impact areas of risk, it's getting methodical about going through a process to just really identify and realize, where do you stack up? Where are the blind spots and where are the areas that we're doing well? And so how do you control? We encourage people to do on a quarterly basis, if you can, assess the risk in the different areas of your business, work to prioritize that. We have a technology that we use to help people do that so that we can get insight into where are the things that are high priorities now, because we all know risk is not stagnant in our businesses. Our businesses aren't stagnant. So what might be a big risk today isn't the same 6 months from now. So that's why we say spend each quarter, putting these processes and plans in place, get through them and reevaluate. Example, Elliot actually alluded to this a little bit ago, but a great example, when you go through this kind of stuff, we had a family business that we were walking through this with, and father-in-law, son-in-law. And when we were talking about business exit planning, perpetuation planning, from a prioritization standpoint, the father-in-law had it least concerning and son-in-law has it biggest concern. And so naturally we asked questions and said, well, tell us about that. And it was really the lens, but the lack of communication. So the lens each was looking through. The father-in-law said, well, I'm not concerned because I got a plan in place. And that plan was, in fact, have the son-in-law be the transition plan. However, that had never been communicated. So the son-in-law has it as the highest risk because he's like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know that there's a plan. I don't know that it's actually coming to me. I've heard rumors and blah, blah, blah. And so that created a significant disconnect that didn't need to exist. And there's some risk there for father-in-law in this case where, if this conversation never happened, who knows? Does the son-in-law say, I don't see a path here, I'm out, and then the whole plan blows up. So stuff like that happens all the time. It's all over in our businesses. We all have different lenses that we look through based on our role in the organization. If we're not spending the time talking with the other leaders on a somewhat regular basis about that, we can miss massive opportunity to get in front of these things.
100%.
So what's next as we do get toward the end? And again, this is what's near and dear to us. So whether you're talking to our team about these things or you're looking to build plans and strategies internally to handle this stuff, or you work with other advisors, however it is, we want people to think through this and go out and do what they can to move the needle and carry their businesses forward. So as we say, create a repeatable process. Again, we advise on a quarterly basis. That's oftentimes how we go about putting our plans and strategies together, not only internally, but for our clients. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew. Pick an area. We talk about the impact areas, really devote a quarter or so to one of those areas and carry it forward if you have to. But, we oftentimes see people that try to tackle multiple areas at once. We just don't move the needle as much. Delegate responsibilities. Again, as the owner, you can't be in charge of all these areas. And also realize that there's so much value in the minds of the people in your organization that are dealing with this stuff at varying degrees in their roles, and make sure those people are involved and are helping move things forward. I can't express to you how often we get into these meetings and the lens from the safety director as far as what they're doing on the safety side versus the lens of the CFO are completely different. And so getting those people to talk and build the plans and strategies to move forward is frankly invaluable. And so make sure as owners and leaders, you're getting the right people involved and delegating the right responsibilities, and then measure. I mean, that's the biggest thing is people don't have a system or process to see if we're improving or getting worse for that matter. So have a way to measure, have a way to know if these investments are in fact moving the needle. And as you see or achieve success, the hope is you can see, that measurable movement forward, and then you can focus on the next impact area of risk. And again, get your team involved and get everybody's impact on that input on that so that it impacts the organization at the highest level. And again, our process, just again, whether it's our team or others, just to kind of highlight how we do it, it really is the 3 steps: prioritize, evaluate, and implement. And, we use our technology, our process, our expertise to go through the 10 impact areas and help prioritize, put it together, evaluate. And then the biggest thing is go out and implement. And, that's where we see ourselves sit in that role a lot from the advisory perspective, is as the accountability coach in a lot of regards, right? Mm-hmm. Is, helping people make sure when we build these plans that they're actually moving forward. And so that becomes the implementation piece. Elliot, what would you add?
I think that's spot on. I mean, take that and use it to your own, build your own process around it. But, when we talk about the risk framework from the start, it's ultimately you want to be starting with prioritizing your risk first, prioritize it, evaluate it, and then figure out how you're going to implement the right risk management strategies to drive profit in your business.
Absolutely. So with that, I think we did pretty good on time. We've got roughly 10 minutes, I hope. Do we have any questions that got submitted? None. Well, I was hoping maybe we'd have a couple questions to answer. We'll stick around for a minute. Cam is pointing at a screen like maybe one came through. Nope. False alarm.
Well, I mean, I saw Tom Witt on here, and I've never known him to be tight-lipped in his life, so.
We did get a thank you from somebody, so appreciate that. But no, we're not going to sign off anytime soon. Love to answer questions if anybody has, or again, if you've got another real life example that you can share with the group, that'd be great. But we will stick around. And we'll also send out a replay after this of the webinar. So you guys all have that. You'll have the information in your inbox at some point soon.
Yeah, it'll be going out as on our feed for the podcast Builders, Makers, Doers as well. So if you're not listening to that, check it out. We do a weekly podcast episode where we interview and have conversations with business owners in the trades and just talk through what they're doing, how they built their business, problems they're solving, etc. Cam just threw the link in the chat, so check that out as well. But this whole podcast will be on that feed as well.
And if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, please join us. We have a ton of fun talking through what businesses are doing, and businesses are doing really cool things every day. So I guess we don't have anything from me, Elliot, Cam, the rest of our team. We thank all of you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your week. It's a Thursday afternoon. We're getting close to the weekend. See you, everybody.
Appreciate it, everybody.